It was midday, and Fasira's yellow sun loomed directly overhead. Beaming across the lush valley and over the jungle camp where Des and his fellow Sith troopers waited. Beneath the shelter of a Sidera tree, Des ran a quick systems check on his GSI-21D blaster pistol, before sliding it into the holster clipped to his belt and turning his attention to his troops. All around him, the men and women of his unit were following his lead, making similar inspections of their own equipment as they waited for his orders. He couldn't help but smile. He trained them well. He joined the Sith armies as a way to escape his previous life. But it hadn't taken him long to actually grow fond of a soldier's life. There was a camaraderie among the men and women who fought at his side, a bond that quickly extended to Des himself. In the military, he'd found his true place. He belonged here with the troops. His troops. Around a year ago, he'd been assigned to the Gloomwalkers, Lieutenant Ulibor's unit. Having tasted far more than a fair share of victories over the past year, the Gloomwalkers had earned quite a reputation, going from one of the 1,000 expendable frontline units to elite troops reserved for critical missions. Ulibor had received many accolades for the success of his troops, but everyone in the unit knew who was really in charge when the blaster bolts started flying. The fact had become painfully clear nearly a year before on Kashyyyk, where Des had seen his first action. The Brotherhood of Darkness had tried to secure a foothold in the Mid-Rim, sending in wave after wave of troops to capture the resource-rich homeworld of the Wookiees. But the planet was a Republic stronghold, and they weren't about to retreat, no matter how badly outnumbered. When the Sith fleet first landed, their enemies simply vanished into the forest. The invasion turned into a war of attrition, a long, drawn-out campaign fought among the branches of the Warshur trees high above the planet's surface. Thousands upon thousands of the invaders were wiped out, most dying without even seeing the opponent who had fired the fatal shot. But the Sith Masters just kept sending more troops in. The Gloomwalkers were part of the second wave of reinforcements. During their first battle, they were separated from the main lines, cut off from the rest of the army. Alone and surrounded by enemies, Lieutenant Ulibor panicked. Fortunately, Des was there to step in. For starters, he could sense the enemy even when he couldn't see them. Somehow he just knew where they were. With Des as their guide, the Gloomwalkers were able to avoid the traps and ambushes as they slowly worked their way back to rejoin the main force. It took 3 days and nights, countless brief but deadly battles, and a seemingly endless march through enemy territory. But they made it. Through all the fighting, the unit lost only a handful of soldiers, and the troops who made it back knew they owed their lives to Des. The story of the Gloomwalkers became a rallying point for the rest of the Sith army, raising morale that had become dangerously low. In the end, it took almost 2,000 units. But Kashyyyk finally fell. As leader of the heroic Gloomwalkers, Lieutenant Ulibor was given a special commendation. Of course, he'd never bothered to mention that Des was really the one responsible. Still, he'd been smart enough to promote Des to sergeant, and he knew enough to stay out of the way when things got hot. Right now, they were the key to capturing the manufacturing world of Fasira. The Gloomwalkers' mission was simple: eliminate the outpost so the rest of the army could launch a surprise attack on the Republic base. The timing was critical. The outpost reported each day at dawn, and if the Gloomwalkers struck too soon, the Republic would realize something was wrong when the daily report didn't come in. When the squad finally received their orders, it was met with horrified gasps and loud whispers of disbelief. They were to hit the outpost in just under 1 hour. Everyone, including Lieutenant Ulibor, inept as he was, knew it was a tactical mistake. By attacking in broad daylight, their chances of success would plunge, and casualties would increase 5-fold. But for all it was worth, the order had come directly from a Sith Lord, and there was nothing Des could do to shake Ulibor's fear of consequence. After just a moment's hesitation, Des raised his fist and knocked the lieutenant cold. Sith Lord or not, the orders were wrong, and he was not willing to risk the lives of his men. At the break of nightfall, the Gloomwalkers moved in. The outpost was theirs. But when Des and his troops arrived back at base camp, they were greeted by the sight of a dozen enforcers standing with weapons drawn. Two of them stepped forward, snapping stun cuffs on Des. Faces grim, a few of the Gloomwalkers began to reach slowly for their weapons. But Des shook his head and they froze. It was only then that Des realized he had underestimated Ulibor's impulsiveness. Now the best he could hope for was a court-martial. There, at least he had a chance. As Des was taken away, he couldn't help but see the look in the eyes of the troopers whose lives he'd saved only hours ago. He had a feeling the next time the unit went into combat, Ulibor would suffer an unfortunate and fatal accident. The realization brought a hint of a smile to his lips. The enforcers led Des to a nearby Sith camp and threw him into the brig, though it more resembled a hole in the ground than any modern holding cell. An interminable period of time passed, Des slipping into and out of consciousness as he tried to gauge his increasingly limited options. Des never got a clear look at the man who'd ordered his transfer, and nobody had spoken to him since he was herded onto the transport ship heading for Korriban. Still, at the very least, he was out of that stinking pit and free of his cuffs. He chose to take that as a good sign. After arriving on Korriban, Des was led by a hooded figure into the temple, and down a flight of ornately carved stone steps. Several minutes passed before they reached the bottom, only to find a long hallway stretching out before him. At the end of the hallway, he encountered a single room, and inside, he was confronted by Lord Kopej, Sith Master, and a member of the dreaded Brotherhood of Darkness. For the next hour, Des was questioned, his goals examined, his power tested. In the end, Lord Kopej presented him with a choice: rejoin the Gloomwalkers as one of the millions of soldiers in the Sith army, or stay at Korriban, learning the ways of the dark side and unleashing the full potential within him. It was only then that Des realized the shocking truth. Everything he'd had, he'd given to his unit. He'd saved their lives too many times to count. Yet when the enforcers had come for him, they'd been powerless to stop them. His friends, his unit, could do nothing for him now. He could only rely on himself. Knowing this, Des gratefully accepted the offer, and was reborn as Bane. Bane of the Sith. The academy on Korriban would become Bane's home in the years following his sudden exit from the Sith military forces. It was where the strongest in the Force were sent, those who had the dark side potential to someday become Sith Masters. Despite being a comparative neophyte to the others in the academy, many of whom had trained there their entire lives, Bane found it surprisingly easy to garner the personal attention of the Masters. Under their focused tutelage, Bane progressed quickly through the ranks of apprentices. On just the third day at the academy, he'd been applying the meditation techniques he'd learned the day before when suddenly he felt it. It was like a bursting of a dam, a raging river flooding through him, sweeping away all his failings, his weakness, his fear, his self-doubt. In that instant, he'd understood why he was here. At that moment, his transformation from Des to Bane, from mere mortal to one of the Sith, had truly begun. Through power, I gain victory. Through victory, my chains are broken. At the end of each lightsaber training session, the class would gather in a wide, irregular circle at the top of the temple. Any student could step into the circle and issue a challenge to another. Master Kasim would observe the duels closely, and once it was over, he would analyze the action for the class. Those who won would be praised for their performance, and their status in the informal hierarchy of the academy would rise. Those who lost would be chastised for their failings, as well as suffer a blow to their prestige. In the past months, Bane had worked hard to learn his style and refine his technique, and today, he felt ready to take another step. Foharg was a McCurth. In many ways, he reminded Bane of the Trandoshans he had fought against in his days with the Gloomwalkers. Lizard-like humanoids covered in leathery green scales, four curved horns growing from the top of their heads. Early in Bane's training, he had fought Foharg, and lost, badly. Now he was here to rectify that mistake. When Bane issued the challenge, Foharg confidently accepted. His confidence was not unfounded. Despite Bane's vast improvement, Foharg was clearly still the better combatant. And minutes into the fight, this proposition proved true, as he struck Bane in the shoulder with an incapacitating blow. Bane fell. Foharg voiced his thoughts. "You trained for weeks to challenge me," Foharg said, drawing out his mockery. "You failed. Victory is mine again. The masters cosset you. They give you extra time and attention, more than the others, more than me. Despite this, you are still my inferior. Bane of the Sith." Bane. Something in the way Foharg said it caused Bane to glance up. It was the same way his father used to say the word. With a scream, Bane thrust his hand palm forward, ripping through Foharg's defenses and catching him in midair. Dark side energy then erupted from his palm, flinging the stunned McCurth back to the edge of the crowd where he landed at Kasim's feet. Bane slowly clenched his fist and rose to his feet. On the ground before him, Foharg was writhing in agony, clutching at his throat and gasping for breath. Unlike the McCurth, Bane had nothing to say to his helpless opponent. He squeezed his fist harder, feeling the force rushing through him like a divine wind as he crushed the life out of his foe. A final surge of power roared up in the core of Bane's being and exploded out into the world. In response, Foharg's body went stiff, and his eyes rolled back into his head. Bane released his hold on the force and his fallen enemy, and the McCurth's body went limp as the last vestiges of life ebbed away. Bane knew his victory over Foharg should have awakened the power of the force within him. But it hadn't. Over the past few months, Bane had made either little or no progress in his lightsaber training, as well as his force capabilities. Fear. Fear of what he was capable of. And guilt. The guilt of discovering his father's death hadn't been a matter of circumstance. That night from his past, when he was whimpering from bruises and scratches his own father had inflicted upon him, Bane had whispered, "I hope you die. I hope you die. I hope you die." The doctors had concluded it had been a heart attack. Shunned by the Academy's masters, Bane spent his days in the archives reading about the histories of ancient Sith. Beings like Darth Revan, Naga Sadow, Frieden Nod, each exemplars of the dark side. Bane had long come to terms with the fact that the modern Sith had turned their back on their predecessors, and it was a rare occurrence to see anyone, master or apprentice, within the archives. So it came as a great surprise when he saw Githany, one of the Academy's newest apprentices, walking in his direction. She was in many aspects a beautiful specimen, but Bane, even in his weakened state, could sense the depth of her power and ambition. He saw the bright fire of the dark side burning within her, and yearned, once more, to touch it. Much to Bane's surprise, Githany would present him with an offer. By helping Bane regain his connection with the Force, he would assist her in defeating Sirak, the Academy's top apprentice. Weeks before, Bane had lost to the Zabrak warrior, and badly. And now he wanted revenge, craved it. Still, Bane was familiar enough with the nature of the dark side to realize that Githany was trying to manipulate him. Somewhere along the road, she would probably at least attempt to leave him behind. But Bane wasn't going to let that happen. Even as he trained with Githany, in the darkest hours before morning's first light, Bane would meet Kasim to practice lightsaber drills and techniques. So while Kasim knew he was growing more formidable with the blade, he didn't know he was making similar strides in other areas. And while Githany could see his progress in unleashing his true potential in the Force, she wasn't aware he was also mastering the intricacies of lightsaber combat. As a result, they were both likely to underestimate the full scope of his abilities. In addition, whenever he wasn't training with Kasim or studying with Githany, he was in the archives studying the history of the ancient Sith. Bane smiled at the irony of his life. He was the outcast the student Cordis had wanted left behind. Yet with Githany, Kasim, and his own study of the archives, he was receiving far more education than any other apprentice on Korriban. The truth would be revealed soon enough. When the time was right, Sirak would discover that he had underestimated Bane. They all would. Bane was confused. The ancient texts said that the Sith were built upon the doctrine of superiority, a system where the strong ruled and the weak served. Yet in the Brotherhood, all Sith were equal. Even Kasim, who was possibly the greatest lightsaber duelist alive, had rejected the old ways, telling Bane that only through cooperation could the Sith ultimately prevail. He had told Bane that this was the reason the title of Darth was no longer used. It was more than just a title, or a symbol of power. It was a claim of supremacy used by those Dark Lords who wished to enforce their will on the other masters. It was a challenge, a warning to bow down or be destroyed. That was why Lord Kaan had ended it. In their war against the Jedi, the Sith needed to focus all their resources on their true enemy, instead of one another. Bane still wasn't convinced, and the more he heard about this Lord Kaan, the more he came to despise him. The way he saw it, Kaan was acting like one of the Jedi, worrying about the greater good, seeking to bring harmony and cooperation to an order built upon dominance and power. Ultimately, Bane nodded and agreed to his master's teachings. But he understood that the mysteries of the dark side's true potential were beyond his reach, and likely beyond the reach of every master at the Academy. To learn what he truly needed to know, he would have to look outward. The night before, Githany had announced her decision to challenge Sirak in the dueling ring. Initially, Bane had been astonished, even worried. Even still, he wasn't stupid. Githany had been trying to goad him into an illegal attack, an ambush perhaps, planted outside the restrictions of the dueling ring. And in the face of her attempt, Bane had suggested a far more interesting alternative. But even as Bane stepped into the ring and challenged Sirak, he couldn't erase the image of Githany's single tear from his mind. Maybe, just maybe, she truly cared. But this was not the time for distractions. Shafts of rain fell from the dark morning sky, and from the darkness, Sirak stepped forward. The Zabrak moved with a quiet yet cautious confidence. While Sirak was arrogant, he was no fool. He was smart enough to understand that Bane wouldn't challenge him again, unless he thought he could win. Bane knew he could probably beat Sirak now, but he didn't want to just beat him. He wanted to destroy him, just as Sirak had destroyed him in their last meeting. Not wanting to waste time, Bane leapt forward, opening the melee with a series of complex and aggressive attacks. He moved quickly, but not too quickly. There were shouts of astonishment from the crowd at his obvious and unexpected skill, though Sirac turned them away easily enough. In response to the inevitable counterattack, Bane let himself stagger back into a stumbling retreat. For a brief instant, he saw his opponent overextend, leaving his right arm vulnerable to a strike that would have ended the contest right there and then. Fighting his own finely honed instincts, Bane held back. He'd worked too long and too hard to claim victory with a simple blow to the arm. The battle continued in the familiar rhythm of combat, the ebb and flow of attack and defense. Bane made sure his attacks were effective yet crude, trying to convince his enemy that he was a dangerous but ultimately inferior opponent. With the swell and surge of each exchange, Bane gently prodded with the force, testing and searching for a weakness he could exploit. It took only a few minutes until he recognized it. Despite his training, the Zabrak had no real experience in long, drawn-out battles. None of his opponents had ever lasted enough to truly push him. Imperceptibly, the strikes of his foe became less crisp, the counters less precise, and the transitions less elegant as Sirac gradually wore down. The fog of exhaustion was slowly clouding his mind, and Bane knew it was only a matter of time until he made a crucial and fatal miscalculation. In the end, his patience was rewarded. Slowly, the Zabrak's desperation turned to hopelessness, and every impulse in Bane screamed with the desire to take the initiative and end the fight. Vengeance. The hunger grew with each passing second until it became a physical pain tearing away at his insides. The dark side filled him, and he felt it on the verge of ripping him apart, splitting his skin and gushing out like a fountain of black blood. Even still, he waited, until the last possible second before unleashing the energy bottled up inside him in a tremendous rush of power. He channeled it through his muscles and limbs, moving so fast it seemed as if time had stopped for the rest of the world. In the blink of an eye, he knocked the saber from Sirac's hand, sliced down to shatter his forearm, then spun through and brought his saber crashing into his opponent's lower leg. It splintered under the impact, and Sirac screamed as a shard of gleaming white bone sliced through muscle, sinew, and finally skin. For a brief instant, none was even aware of what had happened. It took their minds a moment to catch up and register the blur of action that had occurred so much quicker than their eyes could see. Sirac lay crumpled on the ground, writhing in agony and clutching with his one good hand at the chunk of bone protruding from his skin. For a split second, Bane hesitated, savoring the moment, and giving Kasim the opportunity to intervene. Bane froze, lowered his saber, and stepped away. As he walked back into the academy, the crowd parted before him, and a sense of awe emanated from those who had just witnessed the zenith of Sith mastery, the total destruction of an opponent, Dune Mok. It had been interesting to observe the various reactions to his unexpected victory. Githany had been angry, unable to understand why he had left an opponent as dangerous as Sirac alive. Kasim had been rewarding, and a curved hilt lightsaber now hung at Bane's belt. Headmaster Cordis had been difficult. Even while congratulating the young apprentice for his victory, he had berated him for his obsession with the ancient arts. But Bane had won out in the Battle of Wills, and had left the academy for the Valley of the Dark Lords, where he hoped the wisdom of the old masters would fulfill his need for knowledge. Bane had gone into the depths of the Sith tomb seeking enlightenment, but he had found only disillusionment. Korriban was no longer the cradle of darkness. It was a husk, a withered, desiccated corpse picked clean by scavengers. Cordis had been right, but Bane now understood that he was also very, very wrong. Although Bane hadn't found what he was looking for in the tombs, in the long trek back across the desert, His mind had finally become clear. Hunger, thirst, exhaustion, the physical suffering cleansed his thoughts. It stripped away all his illusions and exposed the lies of Cordis in the Academy. The spirits of the Sith were gone from Korriban forever. But it was Lord Kaan's Brotherhood, not the Jedi, who were to blame. They had twisted and perverted the ancient order of the Sith. The Academy's teachings flew in the face of everything Bane had learned from the archives about the ways of the dark side. Kaan had cast aside the true power of the individual and replaced it with the false glory of self-sacrifice in the name of a worthy cause. He sought to destroy the Jedi through might of arms rather than cunning. Worst of all, he proclaimed that all were equal in the Brotherhood of the Sith. But Bane knew equality was a myth. The strong were meant to rule, the weak to serve. For this, Bane knew, the Brotherhood of Darkness needed to fall. Bane alone understood this. He alone saw the truth. And he alone could lead the Sith back to the way of the dark side. But when Bane returned, Sirak and Githany were waiting. When the latter turned against the former, she and Bane easily slew the once-lauded apprentice. This had triggered Cordis' wrath, one of the best warriors of the Academy, dead on the eve of their departure to Lord Kaan's base camp on Ruusan. In front of the entire Academy, Bane had defied the Masters and left the Brotherhood behind, declaring himself Darth Bane, knowing there was none strong enough to stop him.